So we're sitting here with the interview. We have a sort of a weekly interview session where we talk to people we find interesting that might or might not have a direct relevance to finance. I think this topic here, I have a personal interest in this topic because, well, I'm gonna get into that later. But I have an idea that this could be quite relevant for finance. So, without any further ado, I want to introduce you to James Fallon, and maybe you want to introduce yourself. You have quite an extensive resume.
But I'm a simple guy, Severi, so I'll keep it simple. Yeah, I'm a neuroscientist, and I've been at the University of California Irvine Medical School since 1978. So I'm a little long in the tooth on this, and so I've studied a lot of basic neuroscience, a lot on adult stem cells, but also done a lot of genetics and imaging on psychopathologies, including schizophrenia, depression. We look at the brains of people who've committed suicide, but also addictions. A lot of work on addictions, and we use this things like PET scanning and functional MRI plus genetics into a mathematical model. And that new field, the past decade, is called imaging genetics. So we do that for clinical trials, but also for studies that are pretty far ranging. And we look at memory and of different kinds of memory and emotions, et cetera. And I do a lot of the neuroanatomy and the interpretation of the genetics with the neuroanatomy. So that's really what I do on a day-to-day basis.
So, if I'm going to translate this to sort of more conventional way, is this the when you take an image and you have these colors? Because I've seen some of the work you've done on yourself and your family. Is that your field?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. That was,
So I was listening to Canadian radio of all things, and well, you popped up. So it all started in I was in San Diego uh, at a conference, and I started talking to a Canadian researcher, and I mentioned that I have an special interest in psychopathy, uh, namely because I'm the opposite. I'm very much not a psychopath. So I feel like this is interesting from the opposite view. I want to know what I can't understand really. And out of the blue, this guy sent me an interview with you, where you made some quite astounding remarks about yourself, and it's also in your book. You want to tell us a little bit about that and how you came to those conclusions?
yes, it's purely by serendipity. Back in about 2005, 2006, I'd been finishing up a study on psychopathic and impulsive murderers, mostly psychopaths, and some of these really bad guys. And during that, I saw a pattern, and and at the same time, it had nothing to do with the murderers per se. We were finishing up a study on Alzheimer's disease to look for the genetics and image brain patterns for Alzheimer's, and we had all the subjects we needed, but we needed controls, and we hadn't done a whole family. And that combined with the fact that my wife's mother and father had just died of Alzheimer's, and her a lot in her family have it, but she has no signs of it. I said, why don't we give it a try? And she went along with it. It was, I thought, rather heroic to even try to find out this, but she said it would help the kids and grandkids and their lifestyle and what they eat, all that sort of thing. And so everybody agreed. And when we did that, the great news was that everybody in the family came out with kind of a normal range of genetics, normal PET scan, uh, and psychometrics. That is, their actual behavior and how they tested on certain things like reactivity and emotional responses, except one. And it was the last one I looked at, and I looked at that, and it was very pathological. So I just asked the technician to check the PET scanner. I just assumed it was taken from the wrong pile. It was really one of the murderers because it looked exactly like kind of the worst case murders I had been looking at for some years. And they said, no, he came back. It's part of your family. So when I peeled back the code, it turned out to be me.
And this is the
It's
colored. Is this chart that I'm showing now?
yes, right. And for imaging, for brain imaging and body imaging, the standard use is that if an area is hot, that is very active metabolically, if its activity is hotter than normal or hotter in one condition than the other, it looks red or yellow. So the red or yellow, the hot colors, are areas of the brain that are highly active. The ones that are in black, there's no activity, but the kind of the blue and the green means really significantly lower activity. The one on the top there, the arrow is pointing to the frontal lobe, and so the person would be facing, that person's head would be facing to the right, and below that is the same task, which involved emotional and non-emotional pictures. Uh, you can see mine, and this one looks just like what you'd see in a psychopath or a psychopathic murderer, and it's that those parts of the frontal lobe are just turned off and really low. And also, you can't see in this slice, but the amygdala at the front of the temporal lobe is also low, and the area in between, which you don't see right here.
I
Oh,
think
here
we
we go.
see this in this image, don't we?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And you can see there's one, two, three, four, five, six people in those columns, and the rows show a cross section, and the cross sections at the top go through the amygdala, and you can see way on the right that mine, it says Jim, is low and splotchy, and that's very abnormal. Whereas everybody else is quite normal. And on the bottom row is that same side picture, looking from the side. And you can see that although much of my brain looks normal, that part of the frontal lobe, and although you can't see it, the temporal lobe, is quite abnormal. And that's the psychopathic pattern that, after I published this, other people have reported this in the past couple of years. So it looks like it's probably, a good estimation of what the so-called a psychopathic brain, but it's consistent with it. If you have this pattern, it doesn't mean you're psychopathic, but you probably have the traits that are consistent with this. And then below that are the EEGs from the top of the head. And then below that is an example of the genetic analysis. And we did many of these. So that's the example of the profile. And so on the top there, yeah, the reds and yellows are highly active, and the blues and greens are poorly active. The below that, the EEG show coherence, which that is, if you do EEG and look at the alpha wave during rest, those areas that are synced together electrically, the resonating like an orchestra, are the ones in red. And you can see mine on the top of my head is very good. I have a very high amount of resonance, and the others, the middle there, show less so. But that's just to show the upper areas of the brain. Whereas my problem, and the problem with psychopaths, is at the lower half of their brain where there's very little activity and it's poorly regulated.
Okay. So I have to ask a stupid question. Does that mean you're a psychopath?
No, if you just look at the genetics alone, or you look at the imaging alone, you can't tell if somebody's a psychopath. But you can look at these and guess their behaviors and traits. And so somebody who has that pattern, like mine is on the right, you would expect that person to have poor impulse control, probably a compromised sense of morality, and also a compromised sense of what's called emotional empathy, not cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is you understand how people are feeling, but you don't feel it yourself. But most of what people want from each other at a personal level is this emotional empathy, and that can be inferred from both the genetics and the brain pattern. And in fact, in me, it's true. So my traits follow that, but the actual determination of psychopathy, you've got to look at the behavior. So just the genetics and imaging alone won't get you there. Although together they're pretty powerful. It's a really good hint. But taking genetics or the imaging into, let's say, a court of law, it's not ready for prime time yet, because by themselves they don't really tell you that, but they indicate certain behavioral traits are probably there.
So, but you looked in your history, as far as I understood from the book, and I'm gonna buy the book immediately. I did not, for some reason, I did not read this book, and I've read at least 3 or 4 psychopath books. I don't know why it interests me so much, but it just does. and I really want to read this. And as I was waiting for you, I read a little bit of a synopsis of the book, and you mention both in the interview and the book a little bit about your family history, which
Mhm.
is, let's say, unusual.
Yes, it is. You know, at this about the same time that I found our family scans and mine, and so the genetics. My mother, within a couple of months, it was in 1 or 2 months of that, my mother showed me a historical book that had just come out that my cousin, who's a newspaper editor in New York, found, and it's about my father's side of the family. So of course my mother, who's a Sicilian fully, she loved this because here is the British side. There's where the problem is. So I read it, and it was about the first case of the murder of a mother by a son. That is what's called matricide, and the first in the colonies, the American colonies. So that was back in 1667. But she told me to read further, and we sat there, and there was a line of these guys that were murderers, very ill-behaved people who left their families, etc. In that line, it's the Cornell family, and one of my cousins is Ezra Cornell, who founded Cornell University, and in fact, there's a lot of ministers on that side too. But in addition to the ministers, there's a lot of murderers that are not only there but on other lines, as we found out, in my father's side. So there's 4 lines on my paternal side, which have a very high percentage of murderers. But they tend to just murder their own families. So it's a kind of a
Oh my
peculiar thing.
God.
This is a little disquieting for my wife, but
I'm sorry for laughing,
so
but
my
it's an
yeah, I
incredible
mean
statement.
my doors are all locked from the outside now. So, but anyway, uh, so there's this ancestry. But if just because you have murderers on a line in your family, usually after 2 or 3 generations, it washes out. But in this case, there are 4 lines that are convergent. One, by the way, a direct grandfather from Norway.
Really?
And so I'm going to blame it on the Norwegian
Yeah.
side now because I'm getting too much heat when I
Do you
talk
know?
about
Do
the
you know
English
where
side.
in Norway he was from?
What's that?
Do you know where in Norway he was from?
Well, he was from what would be Bergen, near Bergen.
I knew it. I knew you would say
So yeah, I
that.
mean,
Yeah,
right?
it's
You expect
no
these
no
things.
surprise there. No surprise.
so at so at any rate, um, but now what we're looking at, we've just started a research project to see if in fact there are these jumping genes that have to do with social behavior, and it looks like from a paper that just came out that the ones that do jump generations, that is this whole field of epigenetics, where you may have a tagged set of genes that control a behavior, that the ones that jump generations, they might control obesity, etc. So you may be mirroring what your grandmother or great grandmother did, even though your behavior is not that already, but you're set to kind of be ready for it, I guess.
That's
And
incredible.
but they seem to be a lot of social behaviors, frontal lobe related, which is kind of interesting. So it's not just that you get the genetics for violence and aggression and lack of empathy, along with familial behaviors, but the combined effect, that is the combined the epigenomic effect, may reinforce itself by jumping. So this brings the whole idea of transgenerational violence and how inheritable it is on a couple of levels. And so we're very interested. I became interested after writing the book. I said, what am I going to do with this information? So I'm kind of dedicating my research in the next 10 years or more to tracking down the effect of bullying, the tracking down the effect of early environment, but also how it's involved in immigration patterns, et cetera, to see if we can get to really the combined genetics and what behaviors affect it.
Yeah.
What percent of people, especially kids, are susceptible to bullying and abuse? It may be only 20%. It's not everybody.
To be the
Some people.
bullier and to be the abuser.
I'm sorry.
To be the bullier and the abuser, or the to be bullied or to bully.
To be bullied. the impact. You know, there are many
Okay.
people who are abused and bullied, and even though they're angry and upset, they don't go on to develop psychopathy or other personality disorders.
I understand.
So they don't turn in. That doesn't necessarily make them violent. So it's like many people. It's very difficult for many people to get addicted to substances. You know, 20% are like they have patterns almost like they're born addicts, and so that doesn't mean it's a death sentence. You know, but it's the tendency is so strong. Uh, so you know, you want those people to end up becoming addicted to running and skiing as opposed to drugs.
Yeah.
But you know, these things are a hard chunk of it, a large chunk of it seems to be genetically loaded, and this may be involved in violence and aggression and how you bond to people. That doesn't mean that if you have those genes that you're going to become that, but you're going to have the traits. But if you have early abuse, right around the time of birth, after a couple of years, or abandonment, then it looks like it's trouble.
So I have a question. I don't mean to wean off because this is an incredibly interesting subject in itself. But I recently read a story about the Unabomber and how his first year of life affected possibly his whole life, where he had some horrible illness uh, and he was isolated for I think 6 months or something like that, a very long time for a baby. And they say after that he became introverted, and that they suspect that destroyed his whole life. And as a baby, just days alone can be enough to severely alter your life. Is it stuff like that you're talking about?
Yeah, and it's the most susceptible times in your life for these epigenetic modifications. That is, the genes that you have can be modified to be turned off almost forever or turned on inappropriately. Uh, that happens at the moment of conception.
Oh wow.
So your genes are very vulnerable at the moment of conception, but also at the moment of birth. And so that's the peak time. And so if you look at the third trimester, the days of birth, and then the first 3 months after birth, that is the fourth trimester, uh, those are the peak areas where abandonment, abuse, a toxicity, maybe a mother's alcoholism or drug abuse or whatever, but also the father's effect and the mother's effect on the child is really at a peak. After 2 or 3 years old, the effect of abandonment and abuse really goes down, until about your puberty. It can still be an effect. It's not that it won't affect people at 5 years old or 6 years old for their later life. But it just may not be uh, a permanent laying down of a personality disorder that is violent or very dangerous, like in psychopathy or even borderline personality disorder, some forms of schizophrenia. So that's the idea. Is that's the vulnerable period right around birth and the first couple of years after.
But if you look at you, this is one of the things like why I found your story to be so incredibly interesting. You've described yourself as a psychopath, have you not?
Well, yeah, the way that the tests show it, but more importantly, all the psychiatrists, clinicians who have known me for many years and who know my kind of bad behaviors or things that people don't like, they all kind of agreed that I do psychopathic things, and I just never put it together until like 2 years ago. And it actually started, the whole thing started after I gave a talk in Oslo. And that's where your former prime minister, he had come out bipolar, said he had bipolar around 2001.
Right.
And he was brave enough to come out
Yeah.
because, in Scandinavia, Norway, it's not considered a usual thing for people to publicly say that they have a psychiatric disorder, especially a politician, and especially bipolar or depression. And he did a very brave thing. And so he gave a talk, and then I was asked to come over and give a talk on the kind of the science of depression. And we had another clinician there. And during that, I met with some psychiatrists and geneticists, as during the talk, but after the talk, for hours afterwards. And they said, you may have a problem, not only with a certain kind of bipolar, and it's a bipolar that is identified as such in Europe, especially, and in Norway, but not so much in the United States. because I'm hypomanic and I don't show a lot of depression per se, but it's still bipolar. But they also were concerned about the psychopathy. They saw that my genetics, the progression of my disorders from childhood onward, because I had them all listed when they occurred, and my brain pattern and some of the behaviors when I was talking to them, because these guys were experts. So that was a few years ago. After that talk in what was it, 2.5 years ago, in Oslo, and then I came back home and started asking everybody because that's the first time it started to really be interesting to me, because I didn't care before. Then it was like, geez, maybe I really have this. So it's maybe not the theory is wrong. Maybe I'm wrong about who I am. And in that process, I found out I'm not exactly who I thought I was, which is why I wrote the book. I thought it was important for people to know, hopefully, some of the science, the brain science, the psychiatry, and also the genetics, and the personal story, and how you can be fooled by somebody. And the way I test out is not as a full blown psychopath, a categorical psychopath, but a borderline. And I have a group of traits that are called prosocial. It sounds like a nice term, but it means it's not always nice. It means I can get along very well in society, and I can be, glib and charming, not like now necessarily, but
But is it? Do
I
you have
can, I
superficial charm? Is that like? Is that what you mean?
yeah,
Because I read
superficial
that
charm,
term too. Yeah.
and
Okay.
and always being on the make. Being on the make is that I'm always trying to manipulate people. Even I don't even have to think about it. I'm always doing that, not to get people into bed or take their money or anything like that, but just to have them fully buy into my world. It's a kind of machismo, I think. And it's a narcissistic world where you just want, even for 5 minutes, an hour, that people will buy into this little world you've created, this sandbox. And that sort of thing when it's not necessary. Salesmen are supposed to be glib and charming and manipulative, but it's for their job, and everybody knows that. When it's out of context and you're doing it, then it starts to go into the realm of psychopathy. So these things by themselves are normal, but it's if you do it all the time and it's out of context when you're not supposed to really be doing it socially, that's when it becomes problematic. And I have a lot of those traits, and I began to do them very automatically throughout my life. And I can normally be a very nice guy and sort of interactive. People, strangers like me, but you don't want to be married to me. You don't want to be you don't want to be my mother necessarily, or my sister, or even my brother, or my kids all the time. Because I don't treat them any better than I would a stranger. And so even though I'm not necessarily cruel or mean guy, or manipulative in the sense that people don't want it. I mean, I think a lot of people just like the game. It's playing in the sandbox. But people close to you, this is not what they like. And I was really very interested when I heard Nelson Mandela's daughter talk at the memorial, because this is a great man who sacrificed a lot and did a lot for the world. But he was, as she said, wasn't the greatest father. And if you look at Gandhi, there was the same thing about his family. He was saving the world, his people, but he was not a good family man at all. He just didn't have the interpersonal emotional warmth. It
This
wasn't
is
there.
this is an
And
incredible statement you're making because, I mean, I've been talking to a friend of mine about this very subject about why are so many great men apparent like bad to their families, bad
yeah,
like bad people for lack of a better word,
right.
and famously Alexander Graham Bell was a very bad guy. He was not a friendly man, and he was very rough in business, and he was a bad father really. And what you're saying about Gandhi and Nelson Mandela is kind of amazing, but it also makes sense because it takes a certain kind of shrewdness to get ahead in life. And can we talk a little bit about finance and psychopathy?
Well, sure. Yeah. That there's probably some interest that the financial community should have in this.
So let's start with a movie. Wall Street. Have you seen
Mm,
it?
yes.
Is he accurate psychopath, Gordon Gecko?
No, I did a BBC show with Kevin Dutton, and we went through different people who not only leaders but people in film and TV. And in his case, he was doing what it was appropriate for his job. I mean, we hire people to win. We hire leaders basically to win. We hire investors to win for us. We hire our in extremis soldiers to win for us. And so I think it's very curious that we get angry when they act like winning at all costs, because that's a lot of times what we really want. Not everybody, but if you really if you go through and you have common experiences about what people will tolerate, they want their people, their guys and gals who are leaders and investors to win. It's like, okay, I don't like anything unethical or immoral, but if you get me a few bucks, that'd be great. I'll look the other way. There's a little bit of that, not in everybody, in a lot of people. So we like that. And if you look at, a study that was done, a major psychopathy trait, it's called fearless dominance. And the fearless dominance was ranked by all the biographers of all the U.S. presidents. And that just came out. And in that, it was kind of interesting because the highest fearless dominance, that psychopathy trait, it was in Theodore Roosevelt, and number 2 was JFK, number 3 was FDR, Bill Clinton was number 5, and if you go all the way down the list, toward the bottom were people like Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, which we consider mensches, really nice guys, a great heart and everything, but it correlates very poorly with leadership. So the ones that had the highest psychopathy trait, this fearless dominance, were also considered the greatest leaders. So it's something we're doing, at least in the United States. We're choosing people specifically for their psychopathic trait. Not that we don't want criminals, but if they lie, I mean, FDR, JFK, they lied, but we say, well, they lied for us. They saved us. We beat the Nazis because he lied to us, and an imperial Japanese army because of it. So we let them go, but it was really lying, and so we tolerate it if we end up winning. But those kinds of traits of having a winner, I think we're as a society a little bit in denial, because why do we keep voting these people in? It's like, why do we keep getting the same people over and over again?
That's one way to view it, or the other way would be JFK became president because his father basically rigged an election, and they were incredibly savvy people, and it's really interesting when you get to know the JFK they were ruthless people, and especially Joseph family, Kennedy.
But people in the United States, and a lot of people around the world still love them, JFK and RFK, but they're absolutely ruthless family. And so there's a disconnect there between our acceptance of what would be psychopathy or psychopathic traits.
But let's talk about, would you name people, like let's say Donald Trump?
Yeah.
I don't like Donald Trump. He seems to be a very bad person. He likes to destroy societies, if you've seen what he done in Scotland. I mean, he doesn't seem... Is he a psychopath?
Well, first of all, he's a full-blown narcissist, right? And narcissism and psychopathy, there's an overlap. The thing is that with people like Donald Trump, he's going to tell you, I'm going to get you, right?
Yeah.
He's not sliding around at all. He's absolutely telling you, I'm going to get you. And so that doesn't quite fit with psychopathy, because it says, take it or leave it. This is what I'm going to do. And in a way, he's at the end of the spectrum of what normally we would expect that person to do. As a CEO, to win for his corporations. And so it's right at that point that doesn't seem to make it to psychopathy, because it's just like, hey, this is my job, and you know exactly what I'm going to do. So, it's why do we allow them to happen? Well, that's part of winning, If you're part of either a capitalist society or even a socialist mix of society, you want to have winners at some level. So, you don't win really by being a nice guy generally.
Yeah. And a very good example is Al Dunlap. You might know him, not everyone is. Al Dunlap. I don't know if you remember him. He was the chairman of Sunbeam.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I don't.
He
I didn't
famously was
really
given the
read up on him.
psychopath
I
test.
don't, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, so John Ronson, the journalist
Yep.
and writer, famously gave him the I guess the psychopath test is what's his Bob Hare, the Bob
Bob
Hare.
Harris.
Yeah. So I mean, you can say a lot about that test. I could criticize it easily, but it's an interesting test. But John Ronson did give Al Dunlap the test. Al Dunlap is famous for enjoying firing people, being
Yep.
extremely glib, very superficial, having these gigantic statues in his home, all these things, and like all around just not a good person. And yet he did not come off in that test, that specific test, as a psychopath. Do you think that test is flawed because he because he is such an apparent psychopath was not one?
Well, here's part of the problem with psychopathy or sociopathy too, is that they overlap with so many, other personality disorders that it's psychiatrists don't even include it as an official diagnosis.
Yes. Will
It's
it be
included
included
as
in the?
antisocial personality disorder, which is more the criminal part of it, which is accepted. But the broader idea of these traits of psychopathy, because there's so much overlap with narcissistic personality disorder, and in this case, Dunlop would be a sadistic personality, but uh, psychopaths don't have to be sadistic. Okay, they can be, but it's not really a particularly core trait. And so, even though there could be despicable characters, they wouldn't come out ranked that way because the sadism part wouldn't count for psychopathy. And the narcissism part, which would be enormous for some of these guys, would only count a couple of points. So that's just the way the test is constructed, and it's on all these traits, and then you end up with some break point. It goes from 0 to 40, 40
Yeah.
being maximal. And somebody with a 28 or 30, anywhere there and up is categorically psychopath. But there's many ways of getting to psychopathy, and adding the traits together like a taxonomy, it falls short. It's better to look at their traits and rank them that way, and try not to categorically put them into a particular personality disorder, because some of these guys are high in sadism but not core psychopathy necessarily.
It's really interesting because we can get to ask questions. Like, I mean, it is kind of unfair. I realize this to ask about financial people, but is there anyone that you've? I'm gonna do it anyway, even though it is unfair. Is there anyone in finance that you've picked up on that would have these traits? I'm interested in finance because that's my world.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And I've met a number of people. I could give their names, but I very much will not.
Right.
And I try to stay away from people who I find psychopathic. And um, it appears that there are quite a few people, but it's very hard for us laymen to say that. I mean, uh, I'm not sure that the Patrick Bateman kind of psychopath
Right.
is even real. It's like a
And there-
subhuman. But do you have anyone that you could think of that would fit?
Well,
Like,
I'll answer the question by not answering it. I happen to know a fair number of Wall Street CEOs, only because my brother-in-law was a full partner at Lehman Brothers and DLJ, and it was very well connected to Fortune 500 CEOs, which I've just come to meet over the years. So I know, I met them socially and for a fairly long time. Excuse me. And not one of those was ever seemed in the least bit psychopathic.
oh wow.
And as it fleshed out, I became very surprised at this idea based on my common experience over 40 years of knowing these guys, and being at parties, knowing their families, and still meeting with them, just on a social basis. And there's never an indication that they have any psychopathy. So this recent thing with the idea that there's so many leaders, financial leaders of large corporations, Wall Street investment firms, as psychopaths, was kind of surprising to me. It's in the public discourse now, but I've known people of smaller companies that I've worked with. It wouldn't be like big pharma, maybe biotech. It wouldn't be large investment firms or Wall Street types, but rather smaller investors, right? Small investment leaders. There I have met definitely psychopaths very
Anyone you
clearly. I
could
mean, there's no
name, or is
question.
that
So it's not the big. So in my experience, they're there, but they're small time,
okay?
and they can navigate probably easier because they don't have a lot of visibility.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that there aren't some real psychopaths or borderline psychopaths who are, Wall Street CEOs, but I have never met one, and I've asked around, of course, in the past 5 years of the people I know, and they're quite different than that. They're quite even-handed. One problem with real psychopaths is that they don't have the staying power over a long term to be great investors. They just don't stick with it. The life's either chaotic or they get caught at some point, but they don't stick to it because the return is often not enough over the long haul for them
Yeah.
to stay in the biz.
Yeah, I understand. That's a
Um,
very good, and that would be a horrible CEO, because if you take a guy like the head of Lehman Brothers, Dick Fuld, who I bet a lot of people would love if you would say Dick Fuld was a psychopath. I don't think he was. I think he
no,
was a reckless CEO, but he
no,
wasn't a psychopath.
very different.
Jamie Dimon, again, he's like the hated person of the moment. There's no reason to think he's probably a narcissist, I would think, but I'm not a psychiatrist, but I'm saying none of these people apparently have traits. But what about traders? So we have
Well,
a
that's different because
yeah,
the traders who are a little bit under the radar. And I know of a couple of traders that are real full blown psychopaths in the United States, and for them, they get enough action. There's enough excitement on a daily basis to feed their
yeah.
monkey, as it were. Their hedonism and their narcissism and their all the action, and they can navigate pretty well in that. But that doesn't mean that you're going to lose with them. But of course, and ultimately, you really can't trust them.
But
But you can make
do you think that being a psychopath is a good trait for a trader, on a like a purely sort of a bell curve kind of a way? Would you be closer to the I guess was the right side of the bell curve, or would you be more successful if you're a psychopath as a trader?
Yeah, well, if we just look at it in terms of a couple of key traits, certainly that fearless dominance thing, that high energy and narcissism would be very good to have. But also there was this idea, there was a paper that came out on one of the main warrior gene. It's called monoamine oxidase A, one form of that there was a report that people with that, and it's high in psychopaths too, that those people make better risk investments. They seem to do very well in gambling, much better than other people, and in their investments generally. But that has not been followed up. What has been now shown is that some of those traits, such as that expansive narcissism and confidence and brio, I guess you would call it, uh, what would be the opposite of Janteloven, okay? And
Oh, I don't know if people know this term, by the way. That's a very interesting that you even know that this term exists. Janteloven is I guess it's a Norwegian or at least
yeah.
Scandinavian term, which is basically success is frowned upon. I guess
Oh
is
yeah.
the
Well, it's the unique form of a Norwegian, part of the Norwegian sweet socialism, which is you're just not supposed to show that you're better than anybody. You don't
that is
point it out,
fast. How do you know that
and
term?
and well, doesn't everybody?
Oh, no, no, no. That's very.
No, no.
When I tell people
Maybe we're
about Janteloven that you're not
old
allowed to
enough to know
succeed.
that term, right? Maybe younger people wouldn't because
Yeah,
it's from the 1920s and 30s, really, from the book that
yeah.
was done on that. But and the only, I mean, as a side note, the only place that I know in Norwegian society where you allow public violation of Janteloven is with your Nordic skiers, and because those guys can show off, they can act like drunk Americans, and it's
That's
okay.
so good. By the way, the one you're referring to now is Petter Northug. Do you think Petter Northug is a psychopath? Oh, I would love if you would say that. Oh, I would.
He's an opportunistic parasite on the
Oh.
Janteloven idea.
You're gonna be in Norwegian media in 2 hours. uh,
So,
what do you say? Opportunistic.
I feel a kinship with these guys because I can be a real horse's ass like that too, narcissistic, and it's more fun than anything, but it still bothers people. But anyway, if you go back to the idea of really what is correlated with the ability to invest well and to, if you look at the longest lived traders and investors on Wall Street, and Paul Zak did a study on this about a year ago, came out in a very good journal. He showed that these two key dopamine markers, one's called the dopamine 4 receptor, and the other is called COMT. And it's interesting that these two, which regulate dopamine, especially in the frontal lobe, that a nice level of that is correlated with great risk taking. And so the people who are have organized behavior, but they have a level of aggression and carefreeness that you get from this wanderlust type of gene, this D4 gene that probably arose in human evolution, and it's what makes us climb over the mountain. It's what made one of the reasons the Vikings were so willing to take off. That takes a lot of guts, and that sort of thing pays off. And the other one is the COMT, which arose in human evolution. It also arose when we first started throwing spears, that is, drone weapons, and it changed our sense of time and space. So it probably had something to do with our sense of spirituality too, because we had to then deal with the idea of the infinite. But anyway, those two forms, those two genes, seem to be well correlated with success in investing, long-term success, and having the energy and the drive. Now, being narcissistic above that is not such a bad thing, because it provides an impetus, a real driving energy to do it every day. And that's one good thing about leaders with a lot of narcissism is who really wants those jobs. I mean, people, the average person, thought that every day for years and years, nonstop, had to provide this sort of, charisma and that light around them and the energy to do the job. Most people couldn't do it for a week. They think they can, but they can't. So you almost need some of these traits to create enough energy over the long haul to really make you successful. But another part of this, which may overlap with psychopathy, in fact it does, but it hasn't been tested as such yet, as a parameter in a study, for example, for investment people, would be this turning off of the emotional brain, the area of the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe that regulate emotional regulation, but also are involved in caring about other people. You can imagine that in decision making, very fast, clear-minded, executive, cold cognitive decision making. You don't want all these emotions percolating up. It just slows you down, and it makes every decision, like most people, every decision for people, they do consider the ethical and moral consequences and how it affects other people. If you're not saddled with that, if you're not always thinking of that, and you're always thinking machine-like, how is this going to win? How's this going to win? Doesn't mean you're trying to hurt anybody, but you don't care. Well, that makes you one step ahead in time, and it removes a factor that doesn't make money, which is just, caring about what your decision is, how it affects other people. Because for most people, they're not trying to hurt anybody, but they just don't care if that's part of the equation. So having that sort of psychopathic trait would logically be conducive to better investing. It doesn't make you a nice person, but it's one thing that's, I think, should be tested, because it's some of these traits that probably make one a very, very a very, very clever and good investor, without necessarily having any evil component.
It's incredibly fascinating. You're touching on so many interesting topics here. And I do think you're right in probably that it's very hard to succeed long term in an organization as a psychopath. Would you say that's correct? Do you feel that it's hard? I mean, you're a self-proclaimed sort of borderline. Do you feel that because I presume you work in a big organization, you work in a university, right?
Right.
Do you have trouble?
In looking back, and I only started to consider this a few years ago, and then especially when I decided to write a book on it, because I really had to do some introspection and also ask people truly what they thought of me, and to get a more clearer view. And the clearer view was not at all what I had thought before. But in looking at it, from the time I was in after puberty, I've always been asked to be in leadership roles for everything, government, teams, all the way through the university years. I never had to seek these things out. People would say, "We want you to be, the head of the faculty, the head of the hospital," and I was involved in that because it's part of the ethics of our work. We're supposed to do it. I don't do it because I'm a nice guy, because it's part of the, you get into this. This is what you're supposed to do, and so I've always been asked to do that for almost my entire life without trying. And it's something to do with confidence and some level of narcissism. But I was lucky enough to be fairly smart. And growing up, I was good looking, not like now, because I know I look like a toad now, but I mean through most of my life I was good looking, an athlete in good shape, and a lot of fun, and people could always be around me and expect other people who are interesting to be there. So it's not just me, but I oftentimes have very interesting people at my house or otherwise, because we just open up, widen the gutters. We talk about everything, and people like that, and so because of that, I think people have accepted the other parts, the other nasty parts of my behavior, and when my wife was asked, the BBC came here a couple of years ago and did a thing on evil and all this, and she said, "What can I say?" I said, "Say anything." I'm out. The cat's out of the bag now. And she said that she was married to two guys, and there was this one guy who was this fun, charming, smart, happy, just wonderful to be around, great guy, great regular guy. I was a truck driver, a bartender, a laborer. I came from a pretty modest sort of background, in which I love. So I'm kind of a regular guy, and she loved that guy. And she says there's this other dark character that she doesn't like. And that's generally what people feel about me. And it started a couple of people throughout, I'd say from the time I was a young teenager. There would always be either a teacher, a professor, a priest, a doctor who would say, "There's something, I don't trust you. There's something." And they used to say that very early on. But usually people are very positive about me.
Yeah, but you're describing Tony Soprano in a way.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. In fact, when I was by the time I got to college, some of my friends who knew my wife, thank God I married my wife. We were first dates when we were 12, and then we became friends and been going steady since we were 16. And she's pretty much the opposite of me. And she's still, she's stuck with this. But she and a couple of close friends, they said it's a good thing your mother and father and your aunts and uncles, you were treated so well early on, because otherwise you'd definitely be a mafia don or something.
Can I put up the picture of your family that you used in your book? Do I have permission?
Well, yeah, this is, my mother.
This is the family picture. I think it was in your book or it was in the article. It's coming up here.
Well, that's with my wife Diane and our two daughters, son, and of course myself, and we're swimming. We do a lot of things together. Still, we always have, and they they accept my behavior, and I think because they think it's sort of entertaining in a way. But when we were young, I played with them a lot and everything, even though I didn't, as it turns out, didn't have like the connection you'd think. They're like cute little dolls or something. But as they became older, I became friends with them. And that's a great relationship. But emotionally, it's probably not what you'd think a father would have for their kids, even though they're wonderful people.
So you feel like you didn't have this like deep connection as maybe you hear. I don't have kids, but as I understand that you have this like deeper connection, but you didn't have that.
Yeah, you think you do. I thought I did because I had the trappings of it. I spent time with them. But they remember me being actually more warm and fuzzy to them very early on. What they didn't realize that, a lot of the times after that, after they went to sleep, I was out working and then going to bars in Chicago and other places, dancing and whooping it up. I was really a wild man. But they never saw that, And and when I do that, and I'd go out after working all night long until 6 a.m, because bars are open all night in places like Chicago and New York, where I worked, And I'd come back and I'd tell my wife that, I worked until 1. I've been out dancing, and I'd bring home money because I was a good dancer. So I'd win a couple of $100 in dance contests. So she was like, okay. I did things that would offset a really unhusbandly like and unfatherly like behavior. So I knew how to offset this and to make it okay for people. So I knew I had always that I had to work a little bit and use some talents to offset it with either money or something else, some other perk that I would bring home, and just to sort of, I guess, pay them off emotionally. I mean, I did never said that before like this, but in a way, that's what it seems like.
That's it's such a fantastically interesting time to talk to you. And I just wanna. I know you have to go because you have a BBC interview.
Mm.
I just want before, so I don't forget. I just put up a picture of your book here. It's you can say the title, the full title yourself.
Well, if you just look for the psychopath inside,
Yeah.
it's a neuroscientist's journey into the dark side of the brain, and so it's memoir, and it's also some psychiatry and some genetics and brain connections. I try to put science in there with the personal story and what I think it means in terms of societally and otherwise. But it's something that really changed our life. I mean, to decide to go along with this, even though it arose through serendipity and chance, it was like this story was just happening to me, but I didn't fight it. As these things came up, I didn't fight it. So it's like, maybe I wanted this to happen. I don't know. But anyway, I'm trying to turn this into some. I'm trying to make amends, I think, to my family to find ways to change behavior. And even though they know I don't mean it, they seem to appreciate that I'm trying. You know what I mean? So it's this is a work in progress.
You're truly a remarkable person. I don't think I've ever heard anyone have this much introspective ability. I guess that's part of the job, or
I was able to get some of it from my friends in Oslo. I can tell you that.
wow. This is I didn't know about the Oslo story or the connection. Well, this is just fascinating. Why do you know so much about Norway?
Well, I met some Norwegian scientists in the '90s, early '90s, and one of them, I guess, was your first astronaut. She's a neuroscientist and did some production, and is she and her husband are at the University of Oslo Medical School, and her husband is Ole Petter Ottersen, who I've known since 1978. And we became friends later, but we were in the same area, and he's been the provost of UO for a number of years now, and just a tremendously intelligent and thoughtful person, and just a polymath. He's just a fantastic guy, and I know his wife, who I work more closely with, in the past 20 years. But they would come over to Irvine and do a research project in the middle of the winter. It's better to be in Southern California in January than it is in Oslo if you can't ski all the time. So they were coming over every year and became closer and closer. And I started to give some talks at Trondheim and University of Oslo, and then met many people there. And I just have a real affinity. If you have to have an affinity toward groups of people, I guess I have affinity toward East Africans and Norwegians. I don't know what it is, and
East
in a way,
Africans, like Ivory Coast? No, that's
well,
West
East
Africa.
Africa mostly, because I lived, Kenya
Like,
and also South Africa,
ah,
all along the East Coast there,
I'm so
and I
stupid.
just
I
found a
looked
lot
at
of
the map.
resonance
Yeah.
with many people there, and I found the same sort of resonance with Norwegians, and I
Yeah.
don't know why,
Hmm.
but there's a certain tamed wildness about Norwegians, and of course you're so intellectual, and you try officially to be such nice people,
So it,
and but I think the one interesting thing is the highest readership of Reason magazine, which is the main libertarian paper
yeah,
in the world, is Norway,
yeah,
and being a libertarian, it fascinates me how a certain group of people with a socialist mind, or let's say it's not even socialist, because I don't The more I know about Norwegians, it's not socialism at all. It's wealthy libertarianism, because you can do really nice things. I'm a little facetious there, but I think fundamentally, Norwegians are quite fascinating people because there's a lot of contradictions.
Yeah, no, I think I think you're understanding these people quite well, and socialism is maybe taking it too far, but
Yeah.
it's definitely in that direction. That's for sure.
Oh yeah, sure.
So, do you have any? I'm gonna let you go before an hour has passed. Do you have any last bit of advice for people how to deal with? Uh, I know a lot of people like encounter psychopath or people with psychopathic traits in at work. Do you have any in sports or whatever? Do you have any advice?
Yeah, if you're around a real psychopath, just you gotta slowly walk away. This is a predatory animal, and there's no really good way of dealing with them. By staying engaged with them socially. You want to don't make any big moves and slowly extricate yourself from their lives,
Yeah.
because not a lot of good will come of it. Now there are people with psychopathic traits that are just so much damn fun. It's hard not to be around them. Because they just will do things and transport you to places and take risks with you that you may want. But these are people that are not full psychopaths. Full psychopaths, you got to find out their tells. There are certain tells, and I talk about it in my book what the
Yeah.
tells and behaviors are, because they're hard to read. That's the whole thing. But there are some tells about their behavior that you can find. And I think the good news after this, I spent most of my scientific life being a poster boy for genetics. I figured you are what your genetics were, and I just really was severely that way. And this has showed me that I've been wrong. And scientists hate to be wrong, and I don't like even admitting it. It's really not false modesty. I just hate this, but it looks like I was wrong. And the role of early environment is tremendous. Now, I think it's going to be very important for maybe 25% of the population, and in part of this is like how you treat your neighbor's kids and how you treat your own kids. It's now I can see it as being so important, and I think we got to find some way of finding those kids, of teaching parents without getting into their privacy at all, of how to spot these and then work with maybe nurse practitioners who know enough about personality disorders so that you can then take steps into looking closer at it, into seeing, is this a kid that you've really got to keep from abandonment, unless it's happened already, or bullying, etc. Because not everybody's susceptible. Well, a lot of guys just like to rumble. It's not a bad thing to them at all. But maybe a quarter of the people are, but we know what the cure is. The cure is to early on make sure there is no abuse and abandonment, and that's I think a key up note. And this is free. It's not a pill, and it's not we kind of know how to take care of the problem already, as long as we can identify it very early.
I think that's quite a positive sentiment in a way to end on, and so being nice to people creates nice worlds or something. Creates
It's
nice
unimaginative, but it works.
It really does. So I want to thank you, James. It was incredibly interesting to listen to you, and very nice to talk to you. And it's just very rare you're talking to somebody this open about their inner self. So I want to thank you a lot, and I hope you have a great weekend and you sell a lot of books.
And I'm going to try to get over to Constitution Day again.
Oh,
I
yeah?
hate to miss that.
Wow.
I usually get there and maybe at the Oslo Freedom Forum, and my favorite, the Norsk Derby. If I don't get there, I'm very depressed all year.
Well, you have to reach out.
Okay.
Now you have my emails. I would love to sit
Sure.
down and have a coffee with you. Okay, thanks so much, James. And I want to thank everyone for following our stream. We've been recording all day. We're going to chop this interview up and put it up on YouTube. And I'm sure it's going to be viewed quite a few times because people are very fascinated by psychopaths and psychopathic traits. So thanks you, James, and have a nice weekend.
Have me on again sometime.
For sure.
Be happy to.
For sure.
If there's interest.
I'm going to take you
bye-bye.
up on that.
Great talk.
Bye.